And now we get into the next game in the Valkyria Chronicles series. Despite the first game having a pretty good reception in both the West and Japan, Valkyria Chronicles didn't sell considerably well at its launch. Albeit it did get a boost in sales when the price on the game did drop in the PS3, but the initial sales to the first Valkyria Chronicles did unfortunately made it so that the game would be on the PSP in order to gain a broader audiences. That mindset was probably for the Japanese audience, as the PSP was pretty much on the decline in North America when the second game came out in the West. But still, despite it being on a considerably weaker system, Valkyria Chronicles 2 still got the potential of being good. Albeit the storyline in Valkyria Chronicles ended on a satisfying and conclusive end, but there's still a lot of potential in the in-game universe outside of just Welkin or even Gallia's story. Like maybe a story that allows us to see the inner workings of either the Federation or even the Empire during EW2, or maybe a prequel about Belgian and Thymer, or even just a story about EW1 in general. The possibilities are just What? What? To say this game's high school setting didn't resonate well with a good amount of Valkyria Chronicle fans might be an understatement. It just seems that high school anime hijinks just didn't seem like a natural progression in the series, surprising as that might sound. Just from the get-go, it seems like a weird direction for the series to go towards too. And it seemed like they did the high school setting just because high school anime is really popular in Japan. But is Valkyria Chronicles 2 just that? A game that panders to people who like high school anime, and it just happens to take place in the Valkyria universe, and adds ultimately nothing? The answer to that is not as clear-cut as people would think. Well, at least I don't think so. Valkyria Chronicles 2, even with the high school setting, still felt like Valkyria Chronicles. For one, despite being on a console with more limitations than the PS3, it still had the visual style of Valkyria Chronicles. Albeit it's a bit more pixelated, but for the PSP it looked good, and the visual design still felt like Valkyria Chronicles. There was still that influence on various European architecture based on the times of World War II, mixed in with the series' own fantasy anime style with the new cities they introduced, as well as the new weapon design still falling in line with those influences. The music was also spot on, albeit it reuses a good amount of the original Valkyria Chronicles tracks, but there are tracks that emphasize the slice of life high school elements, with it being upbeat and catchy, with those tracks being well composed. But I'd probably say the best track in terms of the new additions to the soundtrack is probably the Rebel theme. That track kicks a lot of ass. And gameplay wise, it also really feels very Valkyria Chronicle-ish. Albeit they had to change the map system in this game since the PSP couldn't really handle the large maps of the PS3 game, but how they did it was still interesting. With there being multiple maps, you having to take over multiple bases, as well as being able to manage and coordinate your units throughout multiple battlefields, which did change up the strategic gameplay of the first game. It was a good change to accommodate the platform change. The core gameplay still felt the same, with the blitz system still being there with it emphasizing squad-based gameplay, with the combat revolving around a unique blend of turn-based strategy and third-person shooter elements. The control was kinda weird with how it did have to accommodate the change of platform, but it was still decent given what they had to change from the PS3 to the PSP. And the strategic elements of the first Valkyria Chronicles did transfer well to this game. You still needed to know the strengths and weaknesses of your squad mates and utilize each class utility in battle. You still needed to manage your CP well and know how to use your unit turn effectively so you don't waste any unnecessary CP. You still needed to use the overview map in order to effectively plan out your strategies, and etc. And they did add a bunch of classes that were a welcome addition, namely the Armored Tech class branch, which is essentially a melee unit with a shield, with it housing a lot of defensive capabilities with its shield from normal gunfire, and it's being able to house considerable amount of offensive capabilities. But the con is that it does have to get close, and it has rather modest to be depending on which class branch you want to go into. And speaking of class branches, they added various classes that you can branch into when you promote a unit, with each class on either branches of the base class being different and emphasizing different strengths of the base class, or adding something to that class repertoire but still retaining the base class role when planning out on how to use them effectively. Such as promoting your engineer to an A-Theme Corp or A-Theme Elite will allow them to carry musical instruments that will serve to buff your units, but in exchange, the A-Theme Core unit doesn't have the healing capabilities of an Elite Engineer. Both variants still serve in the support role, but still significantly different. Another good example is probably the Shock Trooper line. A Shock Trooper can either go to Shock Trooper Elite or Gunner Elite. The Shock Trooper Elite is basically a stronger version of the Shock Trooper, with a flamethrower of it housing good firepower, defense, and it having modest AP, which makes it an ideal unit to push the enemy lines. But the Gunner is a more defensive unit in a way. The Gunner got a pretty big machine gun with great offensive power, but that offensive power only translates well for interception fire, with their normal attack having them do a very wide spread shot, which usually won't do much damage, which translates them well to be base defenders. Again, the Shock Trooper offensive capabilities are highlighted in both the Shock Trooper Elite and Gunner branches, but in different and interesting ways. And this doesn't extend to only foot soldiers. You can also change what type of tanks you can bring into battle, even changing your tank into an APC if you want. So far, it looks like Valkyria Chronicles 2 still has the Valkyria Chronicles feel to it, and things that they couldn't transfer from the original game, they modified to make it fit for the platform, as well as adding some things that improved overall gameplay of Valkyria Chronicles, such as branching classes, the new classes, the more customization options in general, the overall combat being faster paced. So what's the ultimate problem for Valkyria Chronicles 2 then? I guess it can be twofold, which is namely the story and the overlying structure of the game. The story is, well, it just seemed like they focused on the wrong thing in the story. This could have been a pretty interesting story based on half of the premise of the game, namely the civil war in Gallia. Seeing more of how Cordelia will lead her people out of this crisis would have been great to see, and good development for Cordelia from the first game to see just how far Cordelia has come as a leader from the original Valkyria Chronicles. Also, being able to see more Gallia through the Civil War will allow for some more interesting world building in Gallia. And don't get me wrong, they do touch on those stuff briefly, but the focus is sadly on the high school setting, which is really disappointing. And the high school setting is as typical as you get. You got a class of misfits who are looked down upon, with the entire class not being really motivated to prove otherwise, till the main protagonist, who is the typical hot-blooded youth with a heart of gold, will lead this group to prove that this class isn't just a class of rejects to everyone else in the school. And they do this via a tournament. Yeah, the high school elements are as typical as you get, and result don't really stand out. The characters aren't bad per se, they're not the most grating characters in the high school setting I've seen, but they're just really typical. You got your typical tsundere, the typical tough guy with a kind heart underneath the tough exterior, the bookworm, and etc. The entirety of the high school elements is just that. Typical. They go the typical character arcs you expect and don't really develop past their archetypes. Albeit the side characters in the first game were archetypes, but there were more variety than just a cast of high schoolers, and the main cast of the first game felt really relatable with how they did seem like everyday people. That doesn't really transfer well into the main cast of this game, which is a tad over the top high school anime archetypes. But they're not so eccentric that they're memorable, they just feel standard for the genre. And unfortunately, the focus is on the high school elements for 3/4 of the game, which can be really distracting to the Civil War premise of the game. It's still there, and when they do want to tell the Civil War storyline, it can be interesting. I especially like how they tied the Valkyria aspect at first game. They show what they do with the knowledge of the actual existence of the Valkyrias, and without spoiling it, let's just say they do things to try to replicate it, even if it's not entirely humane. And again, they show the extreme folly of trying to get the incredible powers of Valkyria by any means necessary, and how we need to treasure our humanity even more. Which was the theme in the first game, but you also sort of understand why this type of research would happen given the circumstances of Gallia, a small country surrounded by two superpowers, and the game have a really powerful cutscene outlining this. I also like how the game points out that the Valkyria power itself, as powerful as they are, aren't the problem. They're merely a powerful tool, and it depends on the user how it can be used to either protect and help people or used for destruction, which does tie to the theme of humanity in Valkyria Chronicles. Those aspects of the game are interesting. It's just a shame that the game doesn't really focus on them, instead focus on the high school elements for like 60 to 70% of the game until the Civil War storyline gets a bit more focus. This does overall make the story not all that interesting and a bit disappointing to go through. The other problem with Valkyria Chronicles 2 is that it can sometimes feel like a grind, even a needless grind at times, with how the game is structured. The first is how the story mission progresses. You basically have to do filler missions between the story missions to progress the game, which can feel like needless filler, especially with how the story is told. You don't really get the feel of how the progression of the Civil War is coming along from start to finish. And the filler missions just feel like they're gates to the story mission than a natural progression. Now the filler missions wouldn't be too bad, but there is one flaw that really makes it feel like a grind, and that is the repeatable maps. Valkyria Chronicles 2 level design is sadly not that good. Not that the individual maps and enemy placement are inherently bad, it's just that they repeat a lot of the same map design, which is a far cry to Valkyria Chronicles, where each map in the game was uniquely crafted for that chapter, barring the skirmishes battle. Valkyria Chronicles 2 had a few reusable maps that doesn't really change the tactics from battle to battle, and have overall the same objectives, which overall can make the filler missions feel the same and add to how grindy the second game can be. Now with that said, having a structure like this can work, and they did make it work in the third game with how they presented the structure in that game. In Valkyria Chronicles 2, the filler missions just feels like padding. Another major factor of how the game can feel grindy at times is how you promote. How you promote in this game is now determined by credits. How you get credits is how well your unit does in a battle, as well as RNG. Let me repeat. RNG. Random number generator determines if you can get credits to promote your unit, and it's from unit to unit. Yeah. Depending on how bad your RNG is, you're gonna spend lots of time on a single map to get this specific certificate or credit to promote your individual unit. I get they wanted to differentiate each unit more, but having a promotion system that relies on RNG is pushing it way too far and makes the game feel like a total grind fest at times, unfortunately. Anyway, that's all the major flaws I find with the game. All in all, Valkyria Chronicles 2 isn't a bad game. It's still really enjoyable. It still feels like a Valkyria Chronicles title, and the mechanics they had to adjust for the PSP felt appropriate. For the most part. But the focus on the high school elements and not on the Civil War plotline, and how grindy the game could feel, as well as the map design being disappointing with how they were reused, was certainly a big letdown. Now I would certainly recommend the game. It's still fun, and there are far worse sequels out there. Valkyria Chronicles 2 just felt like it fell a tad short in terms of being a follow-up to the original Valkyria Chronicles.